yours.
Okay, great. Thank you, Hunter. Hello, everyone out there. I am so pleased to welcome you all to our Native American Heritage Month kickoff event. Per the invite that I sent to everybody, this is just the first in a series of events that we're going to do all year long, looking at different aspects of working with Native American tribes. Today, we're focused on collaborating with tribes, how we can do it better, in particular, looking into this IWR report, the Strengthening USACE Collaboration with Tribal Nations for Water Resources Management. Lots of good findings and recommendations in there. SPD and our own Tribal Nations Technical Center of Expertise in Albuquerque were heavily involved, and I think it really bears getting into the details of. So what I'm going to do is say how pleased I am that Colonel DeCiro, our SPD Deputy Commander, is going to open this event with some remarks to help us set the stage. Then I'm going to turn it over to Cindy. She's going to introduce our dynamic lineup of experts and more broadly talk about the purpose of the event, how we're going to virtually interact. Thank you, Hunter, for that excellent overview of how to use this space. So I want to thank Cindy and all the panel members and the Deputy Commander and Hunter for all the prep that I know was involved in getting ready for today, and I'm excited to get going. So, Cindy, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Josephine. With the first slide, I would like each of the team members who are here today just to briefly introduce yourself. We do have a dynamic team. Oh, we were going to turn it over to Colonel DeCiro, right, Josephine?
Yes, we were.
Go ahead, sir.
I said Sydney, but it's all yours, sir.
Hey, it was a good slide. I was looking forward to the presentation. Hey, regardless, I know General Owen really wanted to be here. He got pulled into the virtual award ceremony. We had, I think, four people get awarded awards, including Civilian of the Year for us down at the Border District. Great job with our people. Hunter, Dr. Axt, Cindy, thanks for putting this together. What a great program and timely. The Native American celebration, it is key. As a military member, I'm always impressed with the Native American culture. They serve higher in the armed forces than any other demographic of the United States. Currently, since 9/11, 19% of Native Americans have served in the armed forces, 19%. The next average or highest demographic is 14%. And so very much appreciate the Native American culture and their service to the nation. Our nation has long recognized the sovereign status of the tribes. The United States Constitution has clearly always said tribal or our treaties among the tribes are the supreme law of the land, right next to our Constitution. And Article 6 of the Constitution says that clearly. The supreme law of the land are our treaties. And the principles outlined in the Constitution and the treaties, as well as those established by federal laws and regulations and executive orders, they continue to guide our national policy towards the tribal nations. And the USACE Tribal Nations Program implements the DoD American Indian and Alaska Native policy and the USACE Tribal Policy Principles. And we acknowledge the wisdom that the tribes are able to bring to the table and how those programs and projects and activities are enhanced by their input. And here in the division, there are 170 recognized federal tribes, or nearly about a third of the nation's tribes reside in the South Pacific Division. And we appreciate Albuquerque and their expertise as they run the USACE Tribal Center of Expertise on behalf of the entire enterprise. And so today we're going to spend time here in the feedback that USACE has received through a series of workshops with the tribes across the nation to better understand how we can strengthen the USACE collaboration with the tribes. And with that, I'm really looking forward to the presentation and what we have. I really saw the other CX, the collaboration CX POCs on here. It'll be a great session. So looking forward to it. Please discuss. Please bring up questions, and please get any clarification that you may need on our collaboration with the tribe. With that, I'll kick it back to you, Cindy. Thanks.
Thank you, sir. Really appreciate your participation and kicking us off today. As we've alluded to, we have several members within SPD who have joined us today to help with this event. We also are welcoming Seth Cohen from IWR with the Collaboration Participation Center of Expertise. I myself, I'm Cindy Tejeda. You probably all have at least heard of me. I'm a Watershed and Floodplain Program Manager within SPD in Planning and Policy. One of the many hats I wear is to work with tribes. I'm a tribal coordinator. We don't have a full-time tribal liaison position, but I do the best I can to help with outreach to tribes, providing technical assistance to tribes, and finding resources when issues do arise. And so with that, I think we'll just go maybe clockwise around the photo. Eileen, would you like to introduce yourself?
And this is where that double mute might come in handy.
There is the double mute.
There we go.
Good morning. Good morning, all. I'm wearing my public involvement specialist hat today. I'm with the LA District and day-to-day lead water resources planner, and looking forward to participating. And I'll be leading the land acknowledgement today. Over. Serafina?
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Serafina. I'm tribal liaison for San Francisco District. I'm in Office of Counsel. I have immersed myself in the realm of federal Indian law for the past couple of years and, well, find myself talking about it more and more and more. That is all. Over.
Let's see, Seth Cohen.
Yeah, hi, Cindy. Hi, everyone. Good to be with you. Seth Cohen, I've been working with the Corps' Collaboration and Public Participation Center of Expertise and the Institute for Water Resources for about the last 10 years. And most recently, a big part of my work was working with Dr. Ron Kneebone and the Tribal Nation Technical Center of Expertise on this Strengthening Collaboration report that we're going to share with you a little bit later today. So happy to be here. Thanks.
Thank you, Seth. And Dr. Kneebone. You're on double mute, possibly?
Yikes. Sorry about that. Yes, Ron Kneebone, I'm Director of the Tribal Nations Technical Center. We've been recognized as leaders for the community for 5 years now, moving into our next 5 years of progress. Really pleased to be here today and appreciate the opportunity to speak to folks today. And with that, I'll stop. Over.
Great. And our Master of Ceremonies, Facilitator Extraordinaire, Hunter Merritt, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Hunter Merritt, and that's Echo the Owl. And I'm using my name arrow, which is something I'm hoping that all of you understand how to use, because we're going to be using it next, I believe, when Eileen takes the reins and has us do an activity. Like Eileen, I'm wearing the public involvement specialist hat, and we'll be monitoring chat and hoping to moderate some conversation today. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Before we get to Eileen's slide, I just wanted to provide a little bit of a basis for why are we here. It's not a cynical why are we here. It's not to recognize some other heritage for some other month. It is really to think about the ways in which Native Americans contribute to our society and the ways in which we can take action to help ameliorate past actions, to not only improve our relationships, improve our trust, but really, provide services that are needed to help them build their own capacity and truly realize tribal sovereignty. And so with that, I will be handing it over to Eileen for a short exercise to get us started.
Yes, thank you all. So we're going to do what is known as a land acknowledgement. This will only take a few minutes. And before I call your attention to this map, I would love for you to take a moment to look out your window. If you are near a window, and look at the scenery outside. What do you see? And if you are not near a window, then envision what is outside the building you're in, whether it's your house or your office. Are there other buildings, roads, a very intentional landscape that someone planted, trees, etc. If you're lucky, it is a fairly untouched native landscape, but most of us live in suburb cities, communities that have been altered quite a bit. And in your mind's eye, as you look outside, swipe away, erase those buildings, those roads, the cars, all the street furnishings, and what you have left is the native landscape. And envision this landscape covered in scrublands, either grasslands perhaps. Not a lot of trees in California unless you're high up in elevation or by a canyon where you can see ribbons of trees, riparian habitat, or if you're lucky enough to be near one of the river floodplains, a lot more trees. And in this landscape, the pre-development landscape, imagine the first peoples who lived here in that landscape. And even walking through the very spot where you sit now, where you occupy currently, maybe they were on their way to their favorite hunting grounds, or there were a good food source for gathering or prepping, or on their way back to their home in a nearby village, or just passing through. And these are the people who first occupied, the Native American tribal communities that did once occupy the very space you occupy today. So on this map, if Hunter, you could turn on the annotation rights for everybody. I want you to take a look now at the map and identify your current location on the map. And you can annotate if you wish, as soon as we get the annotation right.
I think, Cindy, you're able to do it. There you go. Looks like we all are able to do it.
Okay. You could put your name arrow like Hunter has shown us. You can also just put a little dot using the marker pen, which is kind of down in the middle. I'm putting a mark where I live in green down below. And I'm seeing a lot of folks are from the Bay Area, and some folks are to the east. I know we have participants in Arizona, and Ron Kneebone is in Albuquerque or in the environs. So take a look at the name of the tribe that once occupied where you are now. And I know the name arrows sort of cover it. But they are the ones who preceded you. They are the ones who preceded the predecessors of the land you're on. The people who first, I guess, built the permanent structures and infrastructure and roads and towns and cities. And by acknowledging their prior existence, we are today recognizing and respecting the Native American peoples as the traditional residents, occupants, and stewards of the very land which you currently reside or occupy. And we just also want to acknowledge that they have this enduring relationship and that exists between the Native American tribes, the one that you are, where you are located, and their traditional lands. So with that, I will turn it over to Serafina. Thank you.
Thank you, Elaine. Let's see. I'm here to provide some context regarding the tribes in California. The situation is dramatically different from the rest of the country. Ordinarily, I posit that the story of the Indians, and particularly the story of federal Indian law, is not just about a collision of cultures, but it's the story of land transfer, and what amounts to is virtually a conquest by law. Generally speaking, tribal lands were reserved and set aside for the tribes as per a treaty drafted between the U.S. government and the tribe, and within the four corners of these documents, as Colonel DeCiro had mentioned, within the four corners are the provisions that lay out the agreement, the boundaries, the express rights, and the implied rights. In California, however, this model is somewhat different. Now, I'm going to cover a lot of ground here, as you can see by the slide, in a somewhat superficial and semi-chronological manner, and I'm deliberately avoiding discussions about depopulation and the effects of disease and many other controversial matters, just in the interest of time. There's a lot of material for such a brief presentation, but hopefully it'll provide some insight into the equity as Eileen's, or I should say Cindy's slide demonstrated. So the map that you saw is not without controversy. Many of the names are colonial names bestowed upon the tribe, some of which are resented and emphatically not in use by the tribes. For instance, the Costanoan around the Bay Area, it's a generic term applied to the coastal Indians by Spanish, and it's considered an insult by many of them. Not all of them, however, but if you contrast that with other tribal names, like, say, the Iraq, that's a name given to them by the Karuk tribe, which basically just means downriver people. So, thinking about whose land the former occupants of the land that you occupy now, and the names given to them. Again, it's not without controversy. So to begin, start with the Spanish mission period. The San Diego Bay was reached by a Spanish explorer in 1542. And the San Francisco Bay was discovered, and I used air quotes if you could see me, by Portola, quite by accident. Spain began its colonization in California in earnest 1769 when the San Diego Mission was established, along with its adjoining Presidio. And the missions were largely constructed with newly Christianized Indian labor and built in areas near Indian population centers, generally right next to the Indian villages and towns. Between 1769 and 1823, 21 missions were established along the coast in present-day California, with all but one established under Spanish rule before the Mexican Revolt was underway in roughly 1822. So Spanish Crown's original intention was for the mission system to be temporary because it was theorized that the Christianized Indians would eventually integrate into the Spanish citizenry and the missions would become Spanish pueblos. But pretensions aside, the absorption of the Indians into the mission system amounted to virtually slavery under the protection of the missionaries, with their working and living conditions supervised. And a full 4/5 of the California Indian population remained outside the missions and beyond the mission sphere. And this nominal occupation, as it's been referred to, covered the entirety of the California coast from San Diego to San Francisco. So from here and through this process, the origin of the land rights of the Indians came under Spanish law. Spanish land grants and the creation of some rancherias were, for all intents and purposes, land set aside for the tribes. So during the Mexican period, we see a gradual change as the secularization begins. The fledgling Mexican government granted citizenship for the Indians, ostensibly to begin the gradual process of mission Indian emancipation. And further, we see the mission Indians entering into the general labor force, unlike Indians in the rest of the country. Some land grants were issued by the Mexican government with Mexican law generally, and the grants specifically, as had been the case under Spanish rule, recognizing that the Indians' homes, farms, orchards, fields, and in the surrounding areas and villages that they were referred to as rancherias, these were to be set aside for those Indians. So, meanwhile, as Manifest Destiny marches on, we see three, in the United States, back east, we see three landmark opinions in the Supreme Court that provide the bedrock of U.S. federal Indian law. This is a trilogy of opinions attributed to Chief Justice John Marshall, the first of which, Johnson v. McIntosh, establishes the so-called discovery doctrine, which holds that tribes are entitled to the right of occupancy on their land, generally referred to as aboriginal title, which can only be extinguished by the U.S. government through sale or conquest or by abandonment. The second in the trilogy, Cherokee Nation v. Georgia, established that the tribes are different in that they are not foreign nations, nor are they states, and describes them as domestic dependent nations, and this creates the paternalistic ward guardian status. The third of the trilogy is Worcester v. Georgia, which enshrines the concept that no state can enforce law over a tribal nation, thus declaring that federal law, particularly with respect to tribal nations, preempts state law. And this becomes the foundation for the duty. Now, these concepts were firmly entrenched by 1832. So skip ahead to the Mexican-American War, particularly to the part where the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo frames the conclusion. Not only did this treaty agree that hundreds of land grants granted by the Spanish and Mexican governments to private landowners were to be inviolably respected, but it also established procedures to review the legitimacy of the grants to private persons made by the previous sovereigns. This obviously included the Indians. Now, some legal sleight of hand disenfranchised those same Indians by citing some arcane Mexican voting laws. And on or about this time, gold was discovered in California virtually overnight. The gold rush ushered in events that would basically forever alter the political, cultural, and legal landscapes throughout the state and, of course, elsewhere, beginning with a dramatic wave of immigration from around the world. And with uncertainties surrounding the nature and the state of land title in the newly acquired territory, and recognizing the need for secure land titles, federally commissioned reports prepared on the subject concluded that the Spanish and Mexican governments did not attribute any value to Indian title. This conclusion is simply not supported by the evidence. So, 1850, under statehood, California entered the Union on an equal footing as the other states. However, conspicuously absent from the Admission Act is any reference to California Indian land rights, unlike some of the other states. In fact, California's first two U.S. senators introduced bills to extinguish all Aboriginal title in California the second day that they were on the job. So meanwhile, between April 1851 and August 1852, a series of 18 treaties of friendship and peace were negotiated with a large number of what were said to be tribes of California Indians. Now, these tribes represented approximately a third to a half, depending upon your estimates or what you read, of the tribes and bands throughout the state. But the Aboriginal title associated with these treaties was in the neighborhood of 75 to 85 million acres. By some estimates, that amounts to about 1/7 of the state of California. But needless to say, these treaties were not honored, despite the tribes relocating and or being removed, and the documents were not ratified by the U.S. Senate, which nulled and voided them. These documents were actually kept in Senate vaults for over 60 years. Also, during the 1850-52 period, the Land Claims Act required every person claiming land in California by virtue of any right or title derived by the Mexican government to file a claim with the Board of Land Commissioners. Meritorious claims were to be honored, and those that were not, for fraud or other purposes, were to see these lands pass into the public domain. Land commissioners were held to a duty to report on the lands held by civilized Indians, and those engaged in agriculture or labor of any kind, and those which were occupied or cultivated by Pueblos or Rancheros Indians. So 2 years to the date, Congress passed an estimate of lands that had passed into the public domain of the Land Claims Act and exempted land in the occupation or possession of an Indian tribe. Over the years, presumptions were made that the commissioners performed their due diligence regarding their duty to report on Indian land tenure, but it actually appears no report was ever made. And it's worth noting that not a single California Indian made a claim under law during these times. Thus, lands throughout the states that should have been set aside for the California Indians were instead opened up to settlement, with the original inhabitants limited, scattered, or actually outright removed. Meanwhile, during this time, 9 military reservations, or farms as some of them were known as, were established throughout the state. Many of them were abandoned over time. 1887, the Dawes Act. It laid the groundwork nationwide to further reduce tribal lands that were reserved or set aside by allowing Congress to pass bills to allot the land in severalty. Many of the remaining original California reservations were further allotted under this process. By the turn of the century, the U.S. Supreme Court nicely tidied up matters, holding that in California, all perfect title was subject to the Land Claims Act's requirement. It's literally every square inch of the state. An Aboriginal land title had long been extinguished by abandonment. And this was evidenced because not a single California Indian filed a claim. Years later, a report commissioned emphasized the need for immediate relief for Indians who were living in small settlements and villages in central and northern California. Based on recommendations from this Kelsey report, Congress passed the Indian Office Appropriations Act of 1906, which included an appropriation of about $100,000 to purchase land for the California Indians that are homeless, currently residing on land not suitable for cultivation. This act was like the first series of appropriations that occurred on basically an annual basis until 1933, that ultimately resulted in a number of small rancherias being set aside, scattered throughout the state, most of which were home sites or rancherias or colonies, and reportedly designed to provide residential sites only. During the New Deal era, U.S. policy towards the Indians reputed the allotment process and encouraged reorganization of tribal governments. The concept of federally recognized tribes largely derives from this process, whereby the tribal governments developed their constitutions under the Department of Interior supervision and approval, and the tribes established their enrollment procedures based on blood quantum, membership rolls, and other criteria. Following World War II, movements toward dissolving many of the tribes and rendering them ineligible for federal services developed. In theory, this amounted to tribal trust lands being divided among members of the tribe, and the tribal entities seizing their special relationship with the federal government and subjecting them to state controls. Nationwide, over 100 tribes were targeted for termination. Almost half of them were in California. By 1977, 12 of the terminated California tribes were variously restored to federally recognized status, with many obtaining their restoration through court order, based upon the Hardwick judgment. But suffice to say that many of the tribes were found to be unlawfully terminated due to unfulfilled obligations of the government with respect to surveying, road building, irrigation development, and other general infrastructure improvements. And since that time, all of the terminated tribes, save for a dozen or so in California, were restored their federally recognized status, but not without cost to governmental integrity, land loss, population, and so forth. So thus, the playing field is far from equal on an already heavily skewed landscape. I see that there's quite a bit here that has been posted. That is all I have, unless there are any questions that we want to address. Thank you.
Thank you, Serafina. So obviously we're talking about a very sobering history that we all share. I just wanted to bring up the precise definition of consultation as we recognize it. So given that past that Serafina discussed, we do endeavor to recognize tribal sovereignty. We do endeavor to, make up for lots of things that were lost in the past, including culture, language, land, and various parts of their societies. And so our mandate essentially is to go through this consultation process. It's not a one-time event. It's an actual process where that should be open, timely, meaningful, collaborative, effective, deliberate communication. And so that is to be at the beginning of the process, not at the end of the process once we've already decided what we're going to do. But if there is some action that we are thinking about taking, or if it's a regulatory permit and others are taking the action, it's our duty to consult with tribes, regardless of their land status, as Serafina was talking about, California tribes don't have necessarily access to their ancestral lands, but they do have a tribal interest in those lands. And I'll just say that for today we're focusing primarily on California because we're taking that metaphor of place, the importance of place, and the SPD headquarters place of San Francisco, and the folks who work in that office are kind of scattered around the Bay Area more or less. So that's what we're focusing on today. But in contrast to consultation, we will be talking more about collaboration, and so that's really the effort to work one-on-one with tribes, develop relationships, develop trust, provide those services that are so badly needed on reservation lands, and to essentially provide the technical services the Corps of Engineers is known for to help them better develop their own capabilities. And so with that, we will move into the presentation portion of our seminar today. And I did want to take just a quick little break. So this will be about 30 minutes. They do have some time for questions and answers, but at the end of that, we have a whole half an hour devoted for discussion. But before we get there, I did want to see if there were any questions right now before we launch into their presentation. And if not, we can just continue the discussion through the chat box. All right, with that, I will turn it over to Seth and Ron. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Cindy. Can you hear me?
Yep, sure can.
All right. Yeah, thanks for the invitation. And this report that we want to share with you, I think some of you may have seen it being circulated on the tribal COP and the planning COP distribution email list, and also for this invite. And it was recently published by IWR on the US States Library and available now, and we're just starting to share it, and wanted to use this as an opportunity to talk a little bit about our lessons learned, and also get some insights and input of that might be useful to SPD. So I'm going to invite Dr. Kneebone to do a lot of this presentation with me, and to specifically kind of get into some of the recommendations that came out of it. I'll start off by just giving a little bit of background on this effort. And looks like I can, if I advance that, did it advance for you? Do I have control, Hunter?
I will get you control right now. I will give you control right as soon as I...
Whatever.
There you go.
Whatever works for you.
I don't have your slides incorporated, so I can share your slides, or you can share them yourself.
Yep. You got the ball. You have the ball, Seth.
They are incorporated, Cindy?
No, they're not.
Oh, they're not. Okay, I thought they were. So in that case, then let me pull up the presentation real quick. I'll say while I'm doing this technical part here. I'm going to have to open this up now. Give me 1 second here. That's not it.
I can open it. Hold on a second.
I can get to it. I thought you had uploaded these in your presentation. what are you seeing now? Are the slides changing at all? No.
No. I got it.
Okay.
Right.
You see it now?
I do have it, but you're going to have to, unless you give me control, you're going to have to move the slides for me.
Go ahead.
Okay. So this is just the kind of an overview of this effort. If you could go to the next slide, please. As Cindy was talking about the differences between consultation and collaboration, we by no means are saying that the two are entirely separate, as Ron and others will probably talk about, but that this effort, started out as from a request from the planning and policy at headquarters and working with IWR to look at how the Corps is doing in terms of this kind of working together and collaborating on projects and studies through the Civil Works program primarily, although the report also looks a little bit at the IIS program, since that's an opportunity that tribes can take advantage of, and became this kind of in-depth effort over the last couple of years to, one, look internally at staff by primarily through surveys and facilitated dialogues across districts and divisions with program managers, SMEs, and tribal liaisons to get their insights and perspectives on what's working and what could be improved across the different programs and program opportunities, specifically looking at water resource management and planning challenges. And then an all-important second step, as I'll get into more detail in a minute, was to hear and listen to tribes about their experiences and perceptions of how those relationships are going, and specifically within the context of projects and studies that are addressing some of their water resource needs and priorities. And so, and out of that to come up with some recommendations that in this case are often about reinforcing some previously identified recommendations that the Corps has come up with over the decades through the work of tribal headquarters liaisons and other folks that have been working hard at this over the years to kind of figure out where improvements could be made, as well as to see if we could identify any new insights and ideas that could be either low-hanging fruit to address or more difficult challenges that might be implemented. Ron, do you want to add anything to that before I move us on?
Make sure that I'm unmuted. No, I don't think so. I think this the idea for this project and some of the questions that were involved in this project grew out of the consultation process that all federal agencies were essentially directed to undertake in the early 90s. And as we were consulting with tribes about activities that we were doing for ourselves, our military customers, or other civil work customers, tribes began to raise questions about how the Corps could assist them. And so that began this process of, we began to question ourselves early on as federal agencies. The Bureau of Indian Affairs was felt among leadership of the Corps to be the the agency responsible for tribes, which a number of court cases in the early 90s through the 80s essentially reversed and say, no, the entire federal government, every agency has a responsibility to fulfill its trust responsibilities and to assist wherever possible and within their scope of their authorizations to all the tribes across the country. So these began to raise their questions. And over. Seth, next slide.
Thanks. Yeah, so to do this, the Institute for Water Resources and our Collaboration and Public Participation Center spoke with Planning and Policy and also with our Senior Headquarters Tribal Liaison and identified the path forward, and the CPCX and the TNTCX as the subject matter experts went about this study the past few years. I just put this up front that at the end of this whole effort, which was recently, we had a couple external report reviewers, meaning external to the immediate team. Internally, we had Ms. Lisa Morales, Nancy Brighton, and some folks at IWR reviewing the report, but then we wanted to ask some folks that were not directly involved. So we had Josephine Axe from SPD, who kicked us off today on the call, and also Mr. Chip Smith, who has, roughly 40 years of intensive experience working with the ASA's office as well as the Corps on tribal issues, provided some feedback on how to improve the report, or at least give some ideas of things we might do in the future that were not able to be addressed by the scope of work of this report. Next slide. So as I mentioned earlier, we did this phase one effort looking at internally what staff were experiencing and also doing some research on existing reports. And the way that we kind of tackled this was by looking at 3 different areas: communication and outreach, program management and implementation, and capacity building of both staff and tribes in some of the cross-cutting opportunities. And then in the workshops that we did, of which there were 7 regional, if you will, workshops, that we focused on districts that were willing and able to host a workshop and get directly involved in the planning of those workshops and invite as many tribes as possible from their AORs to participate. It had a twofold approach. One was primarily to listen and learn from the tribes about their water resource needs and priorities, but also to share those programs, mainly within Civil Works, where some of their needs and priorities might be addressed. 3 of those, in the next slide you can see, took place in SPD, largely because there's so much engagement and willingness to from the districts as well as the tribes to participate. At this time, luckily, we were able to do these in person, which had a real benefit for relationship building. So the first workshop was hosted by the Blue Lake Rancheria tribe, and we were able to have participation from both San Francisco and Sacramento districts at that workshop. Then we had one that we called a Southwestern Focus Workshop in Albuquerque at the district there. And then later on at the very last workshop, we did a standalone workshop with the Navajo Nation, and we had all the districts of SPD present for that one. And that was done mainly because of the amount of work and the scope and size of the Navajo Nation, that although they were invited to the other workshop with tribes in Albuquerque, there was just enough to tackle on the standalone workshop. I do want to invite Serafina and Mark Gilfillan, who were the tribal liaisons present at the Blue Lake workshop, and Jeremy Decker, who was at the Albuquerque and Window Rock workshops, to also jump in with any insights as Ron and I talk about this. Next slide. So I'll share a little bit about Ron and I will share a little bit about the workshops, which was phase 2, just because I think that's more interesting for you right now, being that they took place in SPD. And then at the end of this, we'll give you an overview of the overall recommendations of the report and maybe get some discussion and dialogue around that. But I'm going to turn this over to Ron for a minute, and the next slide will ask for your insights on what you're thinking about. But if you want to just talk about the intent of this slide, if you go back to it for a second, sorry, intent of the slide, Ron, and then we'll have you guys jump in and annotate what are some of the things you think that tribes might be interested in.
Oh, thank you, Seth. The idea of this slide was one of the things that came out of our discussions with both groups internal to the Corps of Engineers and with the tribes themselves, was what Corps personnel thought in going into a meeting or going into a discussion tribes might be interested in. And the tribes themselves, their interests are much broader than what the Corps typically takes to a meeting. The Corps thinks in terms of civil works and civil works only. The tribes are interested in constructing schools and vertical infrastructure and other interests besides civil works, excuse me, emergency response. Tribes are always interested in looking for assistance in these cases because you may not realize tribes are not typically covered in state declarations of emergency. Tribes now, in the early 2000s, or 2011, as a matter of fact, up until that point, tribes had to wait until states declared an emergency, and states typically felt that tribal lands were the responsibility of the tribe, not the state, and so that tribes typically weren't included in their declarations. So some of those introduced laws that changed that process, and now tribes can make their own declarations, which they need to understand in order to make essentially declarations to the Corps of Engineers, which works independently of FEMA and other agencies in emergency response, particularly in flooding and coastal flooding. Next slide, please.
Yeah, so here we just wanted to get some input, Ron, from what people think, and then you can speak to what we heard. But go ahead. And then, Hunter, you might need to help a little bit.
There you go.
For example.
Yeah, annotation's set up, so we're ready when you are. So ask the question.
Yeah, Ron, you can give some examples, but yeah, what we were intending here is just get a little interaction.
Sure. I was going to provoke a little bit. Who do you think, the Corps of Engineers or Native American tribes, would be most interested in how cost share is calculated?
Yeah, and other things you might put on here is just, what kinds of water resources or other related issues or challenges do you think about or that might be raised as important?
And if people are trying to engage with that, Cindy, you're the presenter, so you would allow all to annotate. I know I send a request, so you might have to proactively make it possible for people to annotate. Top of your toolbar, above your name arrow, as the presenter, you have the power. So.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's easy.
Everyone should be able to annotate by now. There you go. Sorry about the delay.
Using the text tool, the TT, is often the cleanest, as you might see. It's a little hard to write with the pencil and pen tool. Yes, seeing a couple on here: salmon restoration, floodplain restoration, less carbon emissions, cultural resource protection, salmon, climate change. Any others? And feel free, feel free to jump in with dialogue if you can't annotate. Just shout out some thoughts or ideas from your experiences.
Yeah. And anybody can unmute themselves if they want to jump in verbally or use chat as well.
I think that's good. We just want to get a flavor of it. Flood risk management, and maybe, I don't know, Hunter, whoever has the master control can move text off of where they are on top of each other. That happens sometimes. But flood risk management, ecosystem restoration. These are definitely, I mean, this is a pretty in tune group, so these are definitely some of the things that not only core districts brought up, but that tribes brought up. But then there were also more specific and nuanced things that we heard as well. We can probably just everyone kind of absorb this a little bit, and then I think we could go to the next slide. Infrastructure, creek bed restoration. So, Ron, I'll let you continue, but this is just one graph, doesn't have all the details of everything we heard, but it's kind of a summary graph that just gives a little bit of a overview of the differences that Ron was showing in the first slide.
I think it's good to point out. It illustrates some of the points that we're talking about, that the issues raised in our meetings with tribes were ranged more broadly than the core personnel actually thought we were going to address, or the Corps wanted to address. They, as might be expected, they essentially wanted to stick to our core abilities, C-O-R-E, those programs and activities that we typically want to present to our potential partners. Tribes are interested in more broad application. They're interested in how well we can partner with other agencies, for example. Most tribes, and it became apparent during the entire conduct of this investigation, that tribes were interested in, as everyone is with limited resources, leveraging as much of their ability and their interactions with federal agencies as possible, to the greatest degree possible. Tribes getting funds from Department of Interior under Section 638, which is the Indian Self-Determination Act, under that authority, federal funds become essentially tribal funds, same as cash. And tribes use funds that they gather that way, and then they are awarded to them that way, and then use those funds for partnerships with the Corps in various activities. A second point that we need to, I noticed cultural resources mentioned several times, and then various other resources. One of the things that's important to note is that tribes really don't differentiate between those two areas. Resources include both historic, cultural, and natural world. So it becomes rather arbitrary and can be an area of confusion in our discussions. Let's go on to the next slide.
Yeah, and agreed, Ron, and you can talk more about this too if you like, but this isn't certainly not all of the issues, but these were a few key issues that were brought up at several of the workshops that took place in SPD as important topics.
Most tribes, their world, their land area is now defined, as Serafina was pointing out, by arbitrary boundaries. And those of us who've worked in the Corps for a while realize that most of the water resources problems of flooding and invasive species and climate and drought resiliency, most of those problems are not combined by arbitrary boundaries. So it became very noticeable that we need to think in terms of how do we coordinate with other jurisdictions? how do the tribes do that, how we can have a positive effect in that kind of cooperation. Over. Seth?
Thanks. No, great. Next slides. And yeah, these are some examples of some of the discussion topics that came up as well. The first slide that we were just looking at, of course, were some of the priorities for tribes around water resource challenges. And when we started getting into discussions like around how are studies and projects kind of working in terms of the relationships, or how are they being carried out, or what are some of the things that tribes would like help with, these are some examples of statements that were made during those workshops. And because we had tribal liaisons and other SMEs on deck or at the workshops, these questions were able to be answered in these workshops, in these face-to-face gatherings.
Just real quickly, Seth, to point out, these we kind of get the impression that these are questions from tribes, but one of the things that was surprising to some is that these were questions asked by Corps personnel as often as they were by tribes. For example, how are projects selected? How is ability to pay calculated? So as in the role of MSC, it's important to realize that communication up and down the chain, from headquarters to the tip of the spear, so to speak, in the field, is important in implementing these policy decisions and policy directives so that people have clear instructions on how these different types of policies are implemented. Over.
Great, thanks. Next slide, please. So this is just an example I thought might be interesting for some of the workshops. You can see that, and I would invite again, Serafina or Jeremy or Mark, if they want to jump in from what they recall from some of those workshops. Like our first one in Blue Lake was quite a while ago, but even though sometimes they were small in size in terms of amounts of tribes participated, they were very rich in discussion. But this slide kind of gets at some of the heavy focus on protecting cultural resources, thinking about how the Corps and other agencies, it wasn't just often about the Corps, but how can federal agencies do better at, involving traditional ecological knowledge and other forms of tribal knowledge into studies and projects, so that important contribution is not lost. And, in one way to do that, they were saying is also to improve the way that there's interagency approaches and collaboration at the federal, state, and county level. And there was a recognition that the Corps has the potential to be a leader in that, if I recall.
This, Ron, again, I just hate to butt in, but in tribal cultural practices and knowledge, incorporating that in the project, one of the things that we have learned in working in actual projects with tribes is that tribes actually find the Corps of Engineer practice of involving our partners as integral to carrying out a project as rather novel. Most agencies provide the tribe some service, and this is what you get, and this is all you get. With the Corps of Engineers, we invite their participation. We actually, in many ways, require it for a successful project. And tribes are able to introduce directly their knowledge and background and of their community and the environment. 10,000 years of knowledge, building knowledge about an environment, does give you some insight. So that our projects tend to be better. Our tribal partners are more satisfied with the project when they have direct, more or less management input to the conduct of that. I know there's been a couple of projects, if Jeremy Decker has his audio up, And you can talk to it on the Rio Grande, where tribes were involved in the projects and were able to directly manage those activities to a degree where the Corps is looking for resolution of a particular issue that the tribe may have not thought about internally, and it takes a significant number of meetings for a tribe to decide within itself what its decision and what its opinion about altering the landscape, for example, would be for flood protection, for example. Over. Go ahead, Seth.
Thanks, Ron. Yeah, and then I just thought I'd share this as an example of a lot of our workshops. Kind of the last part of it was focused on, how can we, if you will, collaborate, communicate, coordinate better. This was usually the district personnel or the tribal liaisons asking these questions of the tribal participants in these workshops. And, this is just an example of some good feedback that we received. A lot of this came from the workshop in Blue Lake, but also some of the other ones. If anyone has any questions or comments, or any of the other staff members that were at the workshops wants to elaborate on this, please do.
I think it's interesting that they're asking to be part of the change of command. I'm not sure that I've seen invitations go out in the past, so that's something to consider.
I do know that Albuquerque District has sent invitations and had participation by tribal members for 20 years. We've had tribal leaders give the invocation at the change of command. It shows that we are interested in them as more than just a particular partner. We're a fellow agency. We have the nexus with tribal nations is we're both government entities. They're trying to do the best for their people like we are. And what you try to do in a project is find that nexus of where that common goal exists. And that allows projects to move forward. And tribes love that about the Corps of Engineers. They're not used to that, and we can build on that. Jeremy just wrote something in the chat box. It's there's examples of this, but the best way that we can incorporate traditional ecological knowledge or any kind of tribal information is to encourage as much as possible their participation. And it's not always an easy task. And commands, I know that the previous commander SPD, General Colton, had that essentially mindset when she met with the Navajo Nation recently, or not recently, I guess it was last summer. Met with them to talk about the issues and challenges that they're interested in. As one might think, in California, you've got tribes that are a square mile to the Navajo Nation, which is 24,000 square miles. From a handful of tribal members to 300,000, as big as the state of West Virginia. So the tribal needs span that gamut from simple floodplain mapping to floodplain to flood protection, building dams. Tribes want dams built. One thing that the Corps is doing with, real quickly, Seth, now shut up, sorry, is we're working with a Bureau of Reclamation evaluates dams for tribes across the country. And the Corps is recently expanding its partnership with them to help BIA and Bureau of Reclamation in evaluating dam safety. It's really an unacknowledged problem on the Navajo Nation alone. There are over 800 failing dams. On that Jeremy mentioned in his chat box, the Pueblo of Santa Clara, a small pueblo, just a few square miles, but they've got 13 dams that are in relatively sketchy shape. So an area that the Corps can help and should be aware of is those needs among the tribes. Now, sorry, Seth.
Oh, no, I think people are probably learning more from listening to you than from the slides, but I just, in the interest of time, want to make sure we get to
understood.
The recommendations and discussion. But so maybe just let's spend just maybe 1 minute on this slide, but I just wanted to highlight that, again, we did have this interesting and very productive workshop with the Navajo Nation in which we had tribal liaisons from Albuquerque, LA, Sacramento, and also from Cindy from the division there, and the TNTCX, and then several staff members from the Department of Water Resources at Navajo Nation, and then members of the different chapters that they invited. And so it was another opportunity to do some exchange and learn from both sides how coordination could be improved and get some good data that Corps can work with for moving forward. You want to add anything to that real quick before we go to the recommendation slide, Ron, or Jeremy, or anyone that was there?
No, I think the idea was that, and I think that was SPD helped promote that and recognize that as the Navajo Nation, the unmet needs of the Navajo Nation are beyond any single district and are a challenge even for just SPD alone. So the idea of creating this one door to the Corps and trying to introduce uniformity and a policy and process is one that the tribe is really positive about. And I think we are on the verge of essentially seeing that effort increase dramatically. Over.
Thanks, Ron. And I know some of you may be forming questions or thinking of things, and we want to get to that soon. But next slide. Yeah, we'll just put this up for 30 seconds or so, have you folks can read it. But these are just some more things that came out of that workshop, clearing up information. What people said was beneficial from having the workshop face-to-face, hearing diverse viewpoints, getting input on how things work at USACE was helpful for the Navajo Nation participants, and building those personal relationships with staff at the different districts. Next slide. So the report recommendations, I'm going to let Ron talk through some of these and see if there's any particular points that may be emphasized of things that these, of course, are given to headquarters, and that we hope that we will be able to do some follow-up discussions, including with all the folks that participated in the study. But I think there's also things that the divisions and districts can already, act on and think about in their own context. And it's divided into 3 sections: the communication and outreach, program implementation, and capacity building. So, Ron, do you want to just take us through these and then make sure we've got, I guess, about 20 minutes left. So maybe we'll have save some time for any Q&A discussion that you have on the report.
In other words, keep my comments brief.
Highlight
one of the things that one of the interesting things that we learned, we researched interactions with tribes and the Corps perspective of working with tribes back to the early 1990s. And some of the difficulties that Corps personnel and tribes were encountering, especially Corps personnel, were common all the way back 30, 40 years ago. So it pointed out that internal and external communication, internal to the Corps, that we communicate to our people how things work. How do we do it? I think Cindy's planning and collaboration efforts and increasing, and just like this, is a great improvement, because individuals can now be exposed to the various policy elements that help us move those projects forward and communicate them to tribes. External communication is giving our people the knowledge that allows them to interact with tribes who, many of whom, didn't know we did what we did. If they hadn't been impacted by us constructing a dam, they really didn't know what else we did in many cases. So there's communication and tools, developing tools for fostering increased communication is fundamental, I think, so that everybody has a command of the knowledge about what we do in the Corps of Engineers and be able to communicate that. The frequency of usage communications, both internal and external. Keep this because I think as Cindy is snatching her head bald, trying to communicate policy changes as they occur, and they occur very rapidly across the entire spectrum of what we do. And communicating that to our personnel is a challenge. And then communicating that outside of the Corps is an equal challenge. Looking at types of tools that might do that. The Tribal Nations Technical Center has created a website for USACE personnel, particularly, that has a tribal liaison toolbox that documents and guidance and those types of things reside in, so tribal liaisons can quickly access that type of information. The third bullet here, I think, is one dear to my heart. Basically, we have been passive recipients of requests for services from tribes. When you think in it as a district leader, as a division leader, where the tribes are located throughout your area of responsibility, and you begin to evaluate their position relative to what your mission is, you begin to see that there are opportunities to engage with tribes in a strategic fashion that allows you to assist the tribe, but also complete your mission. An example of this is on the Rio Grande in New Mexico. Entering the tribes in New Mexico are organized along the Rio Grande like beads on a string. If you're going to do controlled invasive species, if you're going to do flood control and flood risk management, you have to involve tribes in that effort. And you do that strategically because tribes, while being Native American communities and having certain rights, doesn't mean they're all on the same side of a particular issue. So it takes strategic management of those engagements. And by increasing the number of in-person meetings, workshops, conferences, any opportunity you can take reduces the need for rapid fire communication. Tribes don't do anything in a rapid fashion. You need to work those issues over the long term. And that's the most effective way to do that is repeated in-person meetings. Over.
Yeah, and obviously we're rethinking that now in terms of the virtual collaboration world we're in, but it presents a lot of challenges. Yeah. So this maybe just highlighting one or two of these, and I encourage you, since we're kind of short on time, I hope everybody will go in and read the more detailed explanations of these recommendations in the report. Ron, you want to talk about any of this? Maybe at least the toolbox that you guys have put up now, which was one of the recommendations.
That was one of the recommendations from the report, and we have been working at it for about a year. Finally got it up and operational, and it's actually found to be very productive, getting a lot of compliments from folks, and as a way to communicate the various strategies and tools needed to work with Native American communities. A couple of things requested at the MSC level, if that's possible, is to help promote that, is additional capacity for staff to actually interact with tribes. There's those of you familiar with, and MSC you probably are, there's very little in the way of resources for outreach efforts to Native American communities, even at the level of trying to develop a project. So any kind of effort that can release that energy and interest that people in the Corps have is welcome. Another is tribal liaisons. Like myself, I started out when there were two others in the country, and now we have them distributed all across the nation, and they're doing great work. Serafina is doing great work at San Francisco. Jeremy Decker is outstanding. Mark Nefillin, he's almost as old as me, and he's doing a great job. But recognizing that for the things they do, recently work along the border for South Pacific Border District has been instrumental in reducing tensions there through just increased communication. So recognizing people for the efforts that they do, often relatively thanklessly.
Okay, next slide.
This is another one that MSCs could be instrumental in helping accomplish this. Clarify the processes for evaluating, selecting projects. Corps people at the district are often as in the dark as the tribe themselves on how those projects fare on our list and up through the chain, up to headquarters and OMB and that process. We can find that tribes are very effective partners if they know how that works, because the tribe then, as essentially autonomous government, can make overtures to those other elements of the Corps and the administration. Tracking of projects is one that is crucial. One of the things that we were questioned about was what's the metrics for this? How many projects do we have? How many dollars are being spent on tribal projects? And it was one of the most difficult questions to find an answer for, because there is no way to roll up projects working with Native American tribes in a quick process. Basically, the senior tribal liaison has to reach out to individual districts and ask the tribal liaison to work with somebody and find out what projects they're doing. One of the methods that might be good for developing that is introducing a command indicator code when a new project is put in that assigns a code tribal project, for example. And then it can be searched for and all tribal projects in the country pulled out. Something as simple as that. Interagency collaboration. MSCs are regional in nature. They work with the other agencies in a regional fashion. Immediately comes to mind the Western Regional Partnership that SPD is involved in, where the command leadership, I think Sheree Peterson is involved with that, meets with them. There's a principal meeting coming up where those agencies can interact and begin to address how they can partner in ways that effectively meet tribal needs. Over.
Thanks, Ron. So I'm sure there's some questions. I think that's the last slide. I'm not sure, Cindy, you can check. There's just gives you some information, but I want to let Ron and you, Cindy, facilitate the Q&A and any discussion about the recommendations or the report. I'll apologize. I have to sign off in a few minutes because I've got to facilitate a meeting on diversity and inclusion for IWR that backs up against this one. But this is a link to the report. You can find it in your copy of the slide deck, as well as some information on rollout if you want to be in touch with either Dr. Kneebone or myself about ideas on how to share lessons learned from the report, please do. So over to you, Cindy and Ron, just to maybe see if there's any questions about what you've been sharing.
Sure thing. I think that Hunter was maybe going to help us with this discussion part, but just wanted to see if there were any initial thoughts or reactions to what was presented. Otherwise, we definitely would like to hear from you on what you think might be valuable or interesting topics for our future webinars. There will be approximately one per month for the next calendar year. And a lot of interesting things coming out of that report. I think we could touch on. Certainly, we'd like to invite our tribal partners to some of these webinars and have an open discussion. But anyway, we have about 6 minutes left in today's webinar. I just want to thank you for joining. And if you have any discussion points or questions, we can go for that right now.
And as we do that, this is Hunter, and I just wanted to say thank you. I'm going to press stop on the recording so that this can be shared with others. But we're going to capture some of the comments and questions that were in chat and maybe just continue the conversation. Also, as you are departing, please leave some ideas about future coffee series topics in the chat and say goodbye and give you kudos. But I'm going to stop the recording at this point and say thank you to all of our speakers for holding the space for this conversation. And I'll stop recording now.